got policy that we're talking about all day, but to me, the most exciting policy changes that can happen in cannabis are the ones that can happen right here in our great state of Missouri. So, as you guys know, Show Me Cannabis, we're working to end marijuana prohibition and cannabis prohibition in Missouri, and we've got a lot of things that are going on throughout the state. Our board of directors largely represented here. I'm Amber again. I live here in Kansas City. This is Stan Viets. He's in Columbia. We've got Maranda Reynolds down in Springfield. We've got John Payne over in St. Louis. So we're trying to cover, every corner of the state as best we can. And we've got different things kind of going on everywhere. Probably some of our more exciting things that are happening is in Springfield. Maranda is leading a lawsuit against the city council of Springfield, so that's pretty sexy. And she can tell you about it. We'll probably go down the line and let everybody talk a little bit about what's going on in each place and talk about possibilities for the upcoming legislative session. Dan, if you want to speak to the point person on that, and then talk about our ballot initiative possibilities. So, let's see. Who wants to go first? Maranda.
Yeah, I can go first.
All right.
As Amber mentioned, my name is Maranda Reynolds. I'm from Springfield, and I'm probably one of the newest activists, well, definitely the newest activist in the group. I got involved when Show Me Cannabis was trying for legalization in 2012. And so I just decided to jump in head first and get my feet wet. I started collecting signatures, and then I worked as kind of a field coordinator in the Springfield area. Well, as you all know, we weren't able to get the signatures for legalization in 2012, but right after that, we were still excited in Springfield. We had a good group of activists with NORML and Show Me Cannabis, and we decided to try to model the ordinance, the decrim ordinance that they did in Columbia, and try to collect the signatures in Springfield while we had everyone riled up and ready to go. So we were able, with the help of American Victory Coalition helping us financially, we were able to collect the signatures we needed in just a month and a half, maybe even less than that. And so after we collected signatures, the process was it would go to Springfield City Council, and they would hear about the bill, hear from the public on it, and they had the option to either pass it or send it to the voters. And the way we had timed it, it would have been on the presidential ballot. But the City Council decided they wanted to invent a third option, which was to keep it from the ballot. They passed it so that they could just go ahead and repeal it at the very next meeting that they possibly could. And they stated this, not all of them obviously, but many of them stated this intent publicly, that they were trying to keep it from the ballot. So obviously this really angered us. We had volunteered our time, our resources, our money, gathered support and everything to get this to the people, and the City Council basically just shut it down. So in response to that, we tried to compromise with them over the next 7 to 8 months. We'd hired a lawyer to come in and try to navigate that with us. We crafted a compromise ordinance, put that up in front of the council, thinking that maybe they would see reason and to hopefully prevent a lawsuit, that they would go ahead and pass that compromise. Well, they didn't do that either. So we were basically left with no option but to go ahead and file a lawsuit against the city to try to maybe get this on the ballot again, and maybe at least recoup some of our costs and our efforts in trying to get this going. So that's where we're at right now. The lawsuit is filed. Oh, and by the way, our lawyers agreed to take the case pro bono. So, to me, that is an indicator that we have a really good case. They're confident that we're going to win. Because, it's just obvious on the face of it that when you have a petition process in place, that's something that we have in Missouri. It's a great power that the people have, that the citizens have. We want to protect that. So not only are we getting to fight for this sensible cannabis policy, but we're also, as a people, getting to fight for our liberty and our freedom to petition the government and to make changes directly, because that's, you know, our only option as citizens, to make change directly. And so I feel, you know, we obviously would have liked it to just go on the ballot and sing a victory in 2012 and just be done and over with it. But, you know, looking back on it, I do feel blessed to have the chance to, you know, stand up for liberty and stand up for democracy and stand up for the petition process. So that's where we're at right now. It's looking pretty favorable, and the court so the city filed a motion to dismiss the case. You know, it's pretty regular. If they can get it thrown out without having to go to court, they're going to try. But we just got word back that the court denied that motion to dismiss. So it's, you know, we're either going to settle it or it's going to go to court. So that's where we're at.
John, you want to update what's happening in St. Louis?
Sure. So in St. Louis, there was a decriminalization ordinance passed along the lines of what was passed in Columbia. And actually it was originally what was proposed in St. Louis by Alderman Shane Cohn it was actually going to still allow for some jail time. It was the specifics of it were not very good. And so we emailed them and contacted them and said, hey, you know, why don't you take a look at what they did in Columbia, which has been in place for almost a decade. And so we took a look at that, and so now we have a much better law, which says that, you know, if you get stopped for possession of cannabis in the city of St. Louis, that you're not going to get arrested, you're not going to serve any jail time, and it's probably not even going to be a fine because the judge is instructed to give a suspended imposition of sentence, which does not show up on your record long term. So there's no arrest and there's no conviction. It's still not great. I mean, you know, you still don't want to get caught, and it's still not legal. But it is definitely a step in the right direction, and that went into effect on June 1st. But it was when we had our last conference in St. Louis in April, it was still awaiting the mayor's signature, and he did finally sign it. Although he didn't he usually puts out a press release on everything he signs, and he didn't even put out a tweet on Twitter. Not even that. So he did it real quietly, and I remember calling Alderman Cohn and asking him, hey, so why haven't we heard anything about this? I mean, hasn't the deadline to sign gone past? And he called around, called the mayor's office, and called me back and goes, yeah, they didn't even tell me. They signed it last week. So that's the mayor is not terribly supportive of us, but nonetheless, he did sign the proposal, so that's good. And also in St. Louis, we have Gary Wiegert, who is a St. Louis police sergeant. I talked about this a little earlier. He's also our lobbyist, and he goes down and represents us in Jefferson City once the legislature is in session from January to May. And he was told back in, I think, March that he could not lobby for Show Me Cannabis by the St. Louis Police Department. Now, he had actually put in an application for secondary employment saying, you know, I'm going to work as a lobbyist. He didn't tell them who he was going to be working as a lobbyist for. And they approved his application for secondary employment. Then when the news hit all the papers, the department freaked out and they said, well, no, you can't. Your secondary employment is revoked. You cannot talk to the press. And so he filed suit against them in federal court. And it didn't even get to the point of a trial. The judge said, yeah, this is pretty clearly a violation of your First Amendment rights. Resubmit the secondary employment, and the city better, you know, you either have to approve it or come up with a better reason than this. You can't just say, I don't like what you're saying, so you can't say it. You can't do that if you're a government employee. I mean, you cannot, the government can't stifle your freedom of speech that way. So he is now free to lobby for us, and he comes and speaks at any of our town hall events that are close to St. Louis. He tries to make it to those, and he's been very effective at reaching out to people that are very supportive of law enforcement, and also he's a Tea Party activist as well. So he is very good at bringing in a conservative crowd that we have trouble reaching out to otherwise. So he's been a great asset to us. And then we don't have a whole lot else going on locally in St. Louis, but I will say that the organization is very strong there, and anytime we have an event, we can turn out a pretty good crowd. So I'm very confident that when it comes time for gathering signatures again to put a legalization measure on the ballot statewide, that we're going to be able to have a very strong group of volunteers in St. Louis. And I think obviously that is the case as well here in Kansas City because we have a good turnout here. But yeah, so I'm very confident in our abilities in the two major metro areas and in Columbia and Springfield. There are other areas where I would like to see more improvement, but I think really the organization has grown by leaps and bounds statewide. It's pretty incredible to watch. So, thank you.
Yeah, I hope you caught that. The lobbyist for marijuana legalization in Missouri is a 34-year veteran active duty sergeant with the St. Louis Police Department. And just as John said, he had to go to federal court to establish his right to free speech. There's going to be a panel later on the impact of marijuana prohibition on civil liberties. That's one example. We have to fight for our First Amendment rights when it comes to this issue. And, down in Springfield, we're having to fight for the simple due process of getting the city to follow its own city charter. It's pretty clear what it says, and the city council just can't cope with the idea that they might have to let their citizens vote on marijuana. They just couldn't accept that. One of the things in our proposal that we gathered the signatures sufficient under that city charter to put that issue on the ballot said that in addition to what's in Columbia's ordinance that we passed 9 years ago, it said that marijuana-related convictions shall be expunged after a certain time and after meeting certain requirements. Well, the city attorney said, we can't put this on the ballot because that's clearly unconstitutional. That can't be done. Right now, there's a new expungement ordinance being debated by the Springfield City Council. A new council member, former member of the legislature, an attorney himself, says, I think you're wrong about that, Mr. Witchmer, Mr. City Attorney. And so he has a lot of egg on his face, I think, right now, because he has to sit there and kind of, after very publicly declaring this is totally impossible, now the council's voting on doing exactly what we proposed, exactly what their lawyer told them was unconstitutional. And the same attorney is about to have more egg on his face because, as Miranda pointed out correctly, in a civil rights lawsuit in federal court, if the motion to dismiss is overruled and denied by the judge, that's pretty much saying you're going to lose. It's not just a preliminary ruling. You're going to lose because that's the number one factor the judges take into account in deciding whether to grant a motion to dismiss is the likelihood of ultimately prevailing. And the judge has just told everybody in that lawsuit that we're going to prevail. And, we have some great lawyers on that case. We have some great lawyers on that case, one of whom was the city attorney for Springfield for 30 years. And you can judge the sincerity of an attorney by his willingness to take on a civil suit on a contingent fee basis. Meaning they get nothing if they lose, and they only get paid if they win. And our lawyers immediately said, we'll take this on a contingent fee basis. And they were right. They're going to win, they're going to get paid, we're going to win. And the council, and especially that city attorney, is going to have even more egg on his face. I don't know how they really can keep him in that position much longer.
That's amazing. I think somebody else amazing.
And another way in which civil liberties have been impacted by this issue recently is, as most or all of you know, we've had a series of town hall meetings around the state. Just public meetings of citizens to talk about this issue. And we had a great one out at the library in Liberty just a few weeks ago. Had well over 100 people show up there. It was a full room. It was an amazing turnout. And we've had similar responses in Columbia and in Rolla and in a lot of other towns around the state. Well, when we tried to set one up in Moberly is a town of about 10,000 people, about 30 miles north of Columbia, and John approached the Moberly Area Community College to use their facilities for this public meeting, which they generally allow. And they initially approved, and then they said, oh, wait a minute, you want to talk about changing the marijuana laws? Well, no, we were not going to let you do that. Well, the ACLU of Missouri, their attorney in particular, Tony Roderick, probably, I think, the best civil rights litigator in Missouri, wrote them a very well done letter. It wasn't a threat, it was just, here's what the law is. The threat was implied. The threat was pretty darn clear. If you guys don't change your minds, you're going to find yourselves in court, and you're going to lose. And you're going to pay my attorney fees, Tony's attorney fees, when you lose this lawsuit, and they backed off right away. But it's just amazing how we have to continue to fight just to talk about this issue.
I understand that they put up a stop point, a checkpoint, looking for
That's true.
licenses and
State
warrants
Highway
over the
Patrol.
exit.
The State Highway Patrol, and I went through it myself, the State Highway Patrol set up a random license check, which is not even anything recognized under the law. And at the exit, most people would take to get to that event. At exactly the time most people would be going through there to get to that event. They just happened to set up this license checkpoint. And we have several Freedom of Information Act requests that are being processed right now to find out exactly why and how and who decided to do that.
But
Because
I
that
thought it
actually-
was wonderful that it got found out and spread out with social media is a great way.
Yeah, I don't know who they thought they were dealing with, you know, I think just get away with that and there wouldn't be any repercussions. They have to understand there are consequences for their actions. You know, I hear that from the law enforcement bullshitters a lot. There are consequences for their actions.
That's right, that's right.
Can I say something about the, we got some of the Freedom of Information Act requests back, and, you know, it's pretty clear, they didn't do anything, or they didn't say anything that would probably get them in real trouble. They were smart enough not to go, hey, we think that there's going to be a bunch of people advocating for legalization at you know, the community college at this time, want to go try to arrest a bunch of them. They were smart enough not to say that, but they do say, hey, do you want to go set up a checkpoint from 6 to 7 on the main exit into town? And you know, given the timing of it, I do think that they probably were, that was their intent. But they were smart enough not to actually put that in writing.
At least not to give it to us.
That's true.
FOIA request. But we do have, we're continuing to do town hall meetings. I know we've got coming up December 2nd in West Plains, is that correct? So if anybody's from southern Missouri, everybody can get to West Plains on December 2nd in the evening. And what's the other, Lake Ozark?
Well, we have, probably most importantly, and we'll talk more about this shortly, but we have Sedalia coming up on Tuesday. And one thing we'll be talking a lot about there is the case of a gentleman named Jeff Mazansky, who is currently serving life without parole for a nonviolent cannabis offense.
And Tony Henninger's going to talk more about that.
Tony Henninger is his attorney here, and he'll be talking more about that a little bit later. But if you can come out to if you can make it out to Sedalia on Tuesday at their, now I'm like, oh, it's the auction house in Sedalia, 300 West 22nd or 2nd Street. If you can make it out there, it's very important to show your support because we're going to try to, you know, encourage the governor to grant clemency to this gentleman. He's already served 20 years, and you know, if he doesn't get clemency, he'll die in prison, and it's just absolutely insane. But we'll talk more about that case, you know, going forward. But Tuesday at 6:30 in Sedalia.
And although it's less important, there is indeed a town hall happening also on Thursday, December 12th in St. Joseph. Now that's one that many of you could get to pretty easily.
Wednesday, December 11th is St. Joseph. Thursday, December 12th is Poplar Bluff.
Apparently there's been a change in the schedule.
I guarantee you those are
I
that's how it
stand
was.
corrected. I stand corrected. But the main mission of Show Me Cannabis, and by the way, how many people here have signed up for the weekly Show Me Cannabis newsletter updates? And anybody who hasn't, anybody whose hand is not up, please do right away. I mean, just, it doesn't cost you a penny. If you want to keep up with what's going on in the state of Missouri in marijuana law reform, you should be getting that weekly newsletter.
And you can sign up right here. If you put your email address up here at the registration desk, we'll be sure and add it to the list for you.
You will be signed up before you know it. And I also urge you to sign up for the National Normal weekly news update as well. Once a week you get a newsletter, a short, compact list of a paragraph about the major national and sometimes international stories as well. Just go to normal.org for that. But, you know, Show Me Cannabis' primary mission is to put legalization on the ballot in Missouri. And whether it happens in 2014 or 2016 hasn't been decided. And we're going to try to make that decision in a rational manner. And so the rational manner that we're undertaking is first to file probably more than one proposed draft of a measure to tax and regulate cannabis like alcohol in Missouri. And that will happen very soon. And then, within a few weeks, we trust, within a few weeks after that, we'll poll on the attitudes of likely 2014 voters in Missouri. And you don't just rely on people who say, oh yeah, I'm going to vote in 2014, but you look at people who actually did vote in 2010, people who actually do vote in a non-presidential election. And among those folks, if we can poll strong enough, and most people say that it's got to be close to 60%, that if we can get close to 60%, then it's likely we'll go forward in 2014. And if we don't poll close to 60%, we certainly will by 2016. We don't want to, launch an effort that's going to fail, but the odds are pretty good. I think like Alison said earlier, the odds are pretty good that we'll be at that level in Missouri by this time, by early next year. And that we may have this issue on the ballot. If we're going to do that, we're going to need a lot of help. We're going to certainly pay some people, and some of you maybe shouldn't be paid for sisters. We're going to also rely on volunteers to the extent that we can. Those who will volunteer to gather signatures will be an important part of that campaign as well. There have been references to the Columbia Ordinance because that was the model for what St. Louis's Board of Alderpeople was persuaded to pass this year. And back in '04, 9 years ago, Amber and I and a group of other activists, including quite a few students and others from the Columbia community, placed on the ballot in Columbia 2 initiative proposals. One was to decriminalize cannabis possession in the sense of eliminating arrests, eliminating the potential for a criminal conviction, and eliminating the possibility of jail. Those are essentially the elements of what most people call decriminalization. Not legal, but it's not a crime technically. And so that measure, we had tried this 3 previous times over 20 years, but we made the fundamental error of not recognizing the importance of being on a presidential election ballot. Because not only do more people vote then, but the demographics of the people who vote in a presidential election are significantly different. The people who vote in every damn election tend to be old and wealthy and Republican. And the people who tend to vote only in the presidential election are the people who are young and progressive and Democrats. And so that's a broad overgeneralization, but it's not an untrue generalization. It's proven true across the country time after time. We proved it in Columbia before we wised up and figured out, let's try putting this on a presidential election ballot and see what happens. What happened is the numbers reversed. After 3 elections where we got only 40% or slightly over 40%, we switched those numbers and we got 60%. And the other side got less than 40% in November of 2004. We also placed on that ballot a measure to essentially, I won't say legalize, but to eliminate all penalties for the possession only of medical marijuana. And that measure essentially says if you have a doctor's written recommendation, you shall not even be charged or arrested. If you get one while your case is pending, then your charge shall be dismissed. And that ordinance has been very helpful to many patients in Columbia, giving them a greater sense of security. No one knows for certain how many people have not been arrested. There's no way of gathering that data, but we know it's helped many patients to feel much more secure, much more at ease, and much more able to deal with their medical problems, which is what they should be able to focus on. And we're proud of that ordinance. In the nation, as far as I know, and I think it's the case, that in the nation, there's only one city whose ordinances require the police to use only the ordinance. In other words, in Ann Arbor and a lot of other towns that have had an ordinance that says it's a $5 fine or a $25 fine, the police have the option. They can use that if they feel nice, if they feel good, if they got up on the right side of the bed that morning. But if they don't like you, or for any other reason, they'll just send your case to state court. That's true in Portland, unfortunately. That's true in the 3 cities in Michigan that just 2 weeks ago passed local decriminalization laws by 60% in a municipal election, which is pretty awesome, which is totally counter to everything that we've known in the history of this movement in recent decades. But nonetheless, the police still retain the option to charge under either state or city law there. In Columbia, they can only charge, at least the Columbia City Police can only charge under the city ordinance. Can they only send your case to the city court, and that's an important distinction. I'm supposed to talk about legislation, so in a nutshell, I'll simply say that we'll probably have more marijuana law reform bills filed in the Missouri General Assembly in the 2014 session than have ever been filed. Representative Chris Kelly from Columbia has offered basically to file whatever we ask him to file, and he will file a bill to tax and regulate cannabis like alcohol. He will file probably essentially the bill, at least one of the bills that we're going to file as an initiative. He'll file it in a form that would ask the legislature to put it on the ballot without our having to gather those signatures. It wouldn't directly change the law, it would give the voters a chance to change the law. He will also file a bill to essentially spread Columbia's ordinance statewide. And that bill was filed last year by Rory Ellinger, who went to school here at UMKC, who is from St. Louis and who lived in Columbia for many years. And there will be bills filed to legalize medical marijuana use, probably by Representative Mike Colonna of St. Louis, who's done this for us before, and many other legislators will join him as co-sponsors. And there will be probably the bill with the greatest chance of passing will be hemp legislation. There was a tremendously positive response among the legislators on the Senate Judiciary Committee last year. It may not have been Judiciary, Senate, shrinking state government.
No, it was General Laws Committee.
The General Laws Committee, as I said, in the Senate last year, held a hearing on a hemp bill, and it was the most positive hearing we've ever had on a marijuana law reform bill. These guys took us deadly serious. The chairman of the committee declared at the end of the hearing, this bill is going to come out of committee. And then he got distracted, you know, they have a short attention span. And so it didn't actually come out of committee, but not because he had changed his mind. And this year, I think it's very, very likely that we'll see a bill that would allow hemp cultivation as an agricultural commodity in Missouri, at least when the federal government allows it. There's an argument to be made that the federal government has already allowed it, although the memo that came out a few weeks back on Colorado and Washington didn't mention hemp specifically. The implication is that the federal government's not going to interfere as long as the states run a tight ship, as long as they regulate, at least as long as they regulate marijuana sales. It's hard to imagine they would come after hemp cultivation, but that remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I think that covered a lot of the general state things that needed to be covered as well. We're getting to where we're running over on time just a little bit, so I'll be brief, which is pretty easy because we haven't had as much excitement in Kansas City as they've had in other parts of the state. We don't have a decrim law like we do in Columbia or now in St. Louis, or the one that is eminent in Springfield. I have spoken with, excuse me, at least one city council member about trying to maybe do something similar. In St. Louis, they went through the city alderman, and it seems like it would be a much more straightforward way. And the impression I got was basically that the city council is probably not going to be pushing something like that. However,
They said at the meeting this morning there was decrim, a thing that they have set up. They have an ordinance. Mr. Nunley they had set up an ordinance of a decrim, a part of here in Kansas City, and it had to do with this is the first time I've heard about it, so that's why I wanted to let you know. That's what they discussed today at their conference over there. And what they do is when they smell it, there's probable cause, they'll take you to, it's called court.
Drug court.
It's called what?
Drug court.
Drug court.
Yeah.
And that's what they're calling their decrim ordinance with this drug court. And what they do with the drug court is if you get the treatment and stay with the treatment that they assign somebody to you or whatever, then it doesn't go to your record or anything. You can just go on.
Well, that sounds like some good money for the drug court people who work there. And it's probably not exactly what my preferred approach would be. And I think that, goodness, excuse me.
It's more.
Yeah, a little bit here. So what I have, and I'm not exactly sure to what you're referring, but I do know that the feedback that I've gotten is that it's very similar to all over the country when you say, if we want to change penalties for cannabis laws, for marijuana laws, they say, well, we don't really arrest people for that anyway. And that was sort of the feedback that I've gotten from the prosecuting attorney's office and just from other folks, and then that was sort of the impression of the city council members who we tried to talk to about this. And so, according to the FBI Uniform Crime Report, there are still about 1,000 individuals in the Kansas City area who get arrested for marijuana possession only.
Including, Chiefs football players. So,
Yeah.
so, I'm skeptical that he's the only one that got arrested in this, in Kansas City this year.
And so, I don't think that we're going to have any leaders spearheading the effort in Kansas City, but we are, interested in doing something. It's a pretty low threshold for gathering signatures to put something on a ballot. So there is some interest, and I'm happy that there's, raise your hand again, some other folks independently coming out of nowhere who say, hey, we want to do this in Kansas City too. And so while we are interested in doing that, it sort of, as far as Show Me Cannabis is concerned, we probably don't want to put that on the ballot if we're going to be doing full legalization in 2014, because generally if people see two things right next to each other, they're going to go for the one that's not quite as drastic of a change, and people would feel more comfortable with that. We want to make sure we're getting the best change possible and the best votes possible. But that being said, if we are not running a statewide campaign in 2014, Kansas City, let's get this done. Let's make our penalties like they are in Columbia and in St. Louis, and like they will be in Springfield, so that people are not arrested.
I might even suggest, now that Portland, Maine is, and those cities in Michigan have done it, it might be worth considering, amping it up to that level.
And that's a
What did you just
possibility.
say?
So in Portland, Maine, there were 3 cities in Michigan that passed what amount to essentially local legalization ordinances. Now the thing is that they can still, as Dan said, those cases can still be sent to state court. And so they can arrest you under the state law, basically, in Portland, Maine, and these 3 cities in Michigan. But nonetheless, it's basically a vote by the city saying, we want marijuana legalized. And that, I have to imagine that will have a powerful effect on Michigan's debate and on Maine's debate, that some of their larger cities have voted for legalization. If you're a representative from those areas, it gets very hard to say, well, my constituents don't favor this. Now you know very clearly where your constituents stand, and so I think that would be certainly worth considering that option.
And Dan mentioned this too, but one of the most exciting parts about that is that they got 60% support too. It wasn't just it wasn't a close win. It was an overwhelming, strong win.
Landslide.
Yeah.
And people are changing everywhere, so there's no reason to think. Everybody I talk to in Kansas City knows somebody in Colorado, and they can't wait for it to be here. So,
Once it's 3,500 signatures, get it on the ballot.
Exactly, incredibly low threshold to get something on the ballot in Kansas City. So, we're going to see some change here
What about
soon.
you do only have a month to do it?
Well, we can do it.
Yeah.
Obviously, we can do this.
I know.
Not without your all's help. So, I don't want to speak too much more because we are running over. I had a couple of, do you guys have anything last minute statements with that? I was hoping we could take questions, but maybe throughout the day, if you have questions, you can speak to each of us individually. We'd be glad to answer that. We're all pretty well informed on what's going on. If it's very, very quick.
Yeah, very quick. Has there been a poll done in Kansas City as far as what people are against or for legalizing marijuana?
We do not have a Kansas City specific poll, no.
Well, I can say that when we polled, this is a year old, and so the numbers have improved dramatically nationwide. But we did a statewide poll last year on the on our 2012 language for the statewide legalization. And that received 50% support statewide, and I believe the support in Kansas City was like 55%. So it's above the state average, obviously. Although I will say it was a little bit below what St. Louis was, which was at 60%.
And that was all voters, right?
That was all likely 2014 voters.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's right, likely 2014. So 2016, definitely. If we don't have it, 2014. That's where we're going. So lots of great things happening in Missouri. It's a very exciting time. I'm glad you guys are all going to be part of it. Please just keep introducing your friends and family to this issue and getting people signed up for our website. On our website for our newsletter. I think we have to move on because we are running behind and we've got a pretty tight schedule today. I did a couple housekeeping things. We have more pizza back there. I know a lot of you went out, but we've got to get it while it's hot. We have quite a bit, so I think I'm going to make an executive decision without speaking to you guys about it. $2 a slice of pizza, so.
Well, I have one more thing too. A woman lost her glasses, so if you see any glasses lying around, let me know.
please go ahead and buy your tickets for tonight's party. I bought mine, and I got ticket number 1. So we need to sell, 2 through 50 or so.
Also on my housekeeping list of things, we have a fundraiser this evening, Anton's Tap Room. It's just up the street at 1917, I believe, or 1910.
1610.
1610? Something like that. 1610 Main Street. It's just a few blocks from here. It's $25. It includes food. We're going to have an auction there, all of our fabulous speakers. There is a problem that we did not
It is
anticipate
a very
before.
cool place. It's
Yes.
excellent.
And so the elevator, there's not an elevator as
Yes,
originally
we know.
folks, but I want to make sure everybody knows we will do our best to help folks who need to get up the stairs. If you have not paid for registration, I heard that maybe some people snuck in and weren't, we're trying to change things here, and we were asking everyone to pay $10 to get in today, help us cover our costs. So if you haven't done that, please, on your honor, head back and pay for that. Students, $5, free for persons with disabilities.
Sign up for the newsletter.
And sign up for the newsletter over here. We also have a texting campaign, a mobile campaign, so you can get updates on your phone. We don't really do a whole lot with that, but we want you to know about important things.
I
So,
disagree about that. We send a text update about once a week, depending
text,
on your.
something's wrong with mine then. Text SMC to 420-420. SMC for Show Me Cannabis, so take out your phones, 420-420. Let's see, I was just going to say, in terms of things coming up the next legislative session, we have a few people who are helping us out here in the Kansas City area, and be sure and give them your thanks when you speak to them. Senator Jason Holtzman is the one who introduced the hemp bill last year. He's going to do it again this next year. He's probably going to be doing some potentially other cannabis legislation. So, thank him, keep him in mind. Representative Brandon Ellington also signed on to our decrim bill last session. I assume he'll be doing the same this next time around. And Jeremy LaFavor, you may have heard some things about him, but he's a great guy and he's a supporter. He doesn't want too much attention to this because he ran into a little bit of trouble recently, but he was very forthright, responsible about his experience, and he actually told me privately that since it has happened, that he has heard from a lot of other people in Jefferson City, and it just sounds like there's some people giving him silent support. So encouraging that there are other representatives out there who aren't quite public yet, but do support what we're doing. So without ado, let's get our next panel up here. Alison, Neil, Dan will be talking about the long haul, ending federal prohibition, and what that looks like.
Franklin?
Neil's right here.
Here a moment ago. Oh, there you are. I understand now.
We have three excellent national experts up here. Dan, if you do not know, is on the National NORML Board of Directors. He's been working on this movement nationally for many, many years. Neil Franklin, of course, Executive Director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, international organization working to end drug policy. And then, of course, Alison, who is based in Washington and works in Washington, but has been very involved with the entire country's movement on this for a long time, and is now getting all over the country, all over the world, getting to talk about this. That's terribly exciting. I thought maybe you guys could give a little bit of a history of the movement so people kind of have an idea of where we're coming from, so that we know where we're going to. And tell your ideas of when you think it's going to happen, how you think it's going to happen, what we can do, and then what you guys are doing. What are the particular angles that you know of from your organizations or other national organizations working on this issue? Who wants to start?
I don't mind, but I just never set up.
I'm saying that I know you have the greatest experience.
Okay, you gotta bring out the hook. Well, as far as our alleged topic here, and how federal prohibition is going to be repealed, my own spin, my own prediction will be, it'll be pretty much like alcohol prohibition is repealed. And although I'm not an expert on it, I've been fascinated with the history of alcohol prohibition and, of course, how it was repealed, how it came to be repealed. Alcohol prohibition, as far as a national prohibition, was passed, if I recall correctly, in 1918, or became effective in 1918. Lasted for, no, 1920 rather, 1920, and it lasted for about 12 years, which repealed in 1932, shortly after Franklin Roosevelt was elected. He had supported repeal when he ran for election. I'm not sure how big a factor that was in his election. But what began to happen is that individual states began to opt out. Individual states had been all on board with liquor prohibition at the outset. And the federal prohibition, of course, many people have remarked that, it took a constitutional amendment to enact liquor prohibition, so why doesn't it take a constitutional amendment to prohibit marijuana? Well, that's an interesting argument. But the reality is that probably it didn't have to be a constitutional amendment to outlaw alcohol, but in fact that's what was done. And I think the proponents thought they had the steam, thought they had the resources and the support to amend the Constitution, and figured once they got that done it would never be undone. Well, it looked like they were correct in the early days of Prohibition. And I think everyone, even though none of us I think were around during alcohol prohibition, everybody's familiar to some degree with what happened after alcohol prohibition was enacted. And it's very much what happened with drug prohibition here today. The fact is that people who were otherwise good citizens became criminals because they were involved in either the distribution or the manufacture of alcohol. Prohibition of alcohol never extended to simple possession, at least the federal prohibition did not extend to simple possession of alcohol, but it did prohibit manufacture, it did prohibit distribution of alcohol, and I think some of the states actually, if I understand correctly, did in fact prohibit possession as well. But what happened again was essentially what we've seen happen with drug prohibition, with marijuana prohibition. For one thing, and it's one of my favorite points to make about prohibition generally, is it makes drugs more dangerous. And that is certainly what happened during alcohol prohibition. During alcohol prohibition, people cooked up alcohol in their bathtub. Bathtub gin was a kind of a common thing back then. And people, of course, making distilled liquor in a still out in the woods, kind of like a meth lab today. And many times the alcohol that they produced was not only of unknown potency, but would cripple people for life. Something called Jake leg. I actually had Jake leg briefly many years ago. I damaged a nerve on my knee and could not lift my foot. And when I went to the doctor, he says, well, what you got here is Jake leg. I haven't been drinking any bathtub gin, but he said, no, but when you bumped your knee on a door jamb, it damaged that nerve. He says, I don't know if it'll get better or not. Well, mine did, thank God. But when people drank, it was primarily Jamaican rum. That's where Jake comes from. Jamaican rum often caused people to lose the ability to raise their foot. And you walk around like the Frankenstein monster. You can't lift your foot. You drag your foot. It's not a pleasant condition. But other people were blinded. Alcohol produced during liquor prohibition often caused people to be permanently blinded. And then it caused a lot of people to simply flat out just die. And you never knew what you were getting. The parallels with drug prohibition today are amazing, and they are numerous. And so the repeal began with individual states opting out. New York State was the first state to opt out. And they said, we're going to repeal our state prohibition. Federal government, if you want to come in here and enforce liquor prohibition, have at it. But we're opting out. We're not going to waste our resources on this. We're not going to go on making criminals of our citizens. You think you can enforce the federal prohibition, go right ahead. Well, and in fact, in a relatively short time, the federal government did exactly what the Obama Justice Department did here a few weeks ago in response to Washington and Colorado. They said, well, in fact, we're not really set up to do that. We're not really, we don't have any enthusiasm for that. And when other states saw that that was the federal government's position, other states began to opt out. And I don't know the precise number, but within a relatively short time, as other states began to opt out of prohibition, the federal government finally did as well in 1932. That's what I believe we'll see happen here. And it could happen in a relatively short period of time. So that's what I'll say on topic, and I'll sit down.
great, because that's a great segue to what I would have to say, which is kind of picking up on that. What we're seeing in the United States is an opting out. In the 1970s, what we saw is a dozen states that decided to opt out of criminalizing adult possession of personal use amounts of marijuana and change that crime into a civil infraction. So you could get a ticket, sort of like a parking ticket or a speeding ticket. But then we froze. We thought we were on a roll, and it was the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws that led that charge across the nation in the 1970s. What happened in the 1980s is sort of a really unfortunate convergence of both conservative parents groups that thought that their kids using marijuana was directly related to this decriminalization effort, and also Ronald Reagan coming into office and running his campaign on a tough on crime, Southern strategy, pitting people against each other rather than uniting them. And we saw the progress that NORML had been behind come to a halt in the States, and that's when we also saw the war on drugs really take off, right? We all think of President Nixon as having declared the war on drugs in the early 70s, but the reality is that the war on drugs really began being waged in earnest under President Reagan. That's when we saw the arrests really start to skyrocket. President Clinton carried them on. Marijuana arrests escalated the most in the Clinton years. And up to this day, we have enormous arrest rates. In terms of looking at the federal law and the interaction with state law, there's also this interesting layer of international treaty laws, right? What's happening right now? Well, let me pause for a second and then just mention the fact that the states started opting out again in 1996 when California passed the Compassionate Use of Marijuana Act. The way that federal drug laws work with state drug laws is very much like with alcohol, in the sense that states can opt out. They can decide not to make things a crime under state law anymore and to leave enforcement up to the federal government. And the reality is that there are very, very few DEA agents compared to state and local law enforcement officers. They carry the brunt of work. So it wasn't that controversial for states to begin opting out through medical marijuana laws and decriminalizing or removing penalties for specific marijuana-related activities. The landmark legislation for marijuana really was New Mexico's medical marijuana law. Because when New Mexico passed its medical marijuana law, it included a regulatory structure that actually created a system for legally producing and distributing marijuana. Up to that point, all the medical marijuana laws that had been passed simply decriminalized, or in the case of Washington, provided an affirmative defense, but they didn't actually proactively create a system for producing and making cannabis available to patients under a legal system, under state law. New Mexico did that, and then more states followed suit and started adopting regulatory systems. That's when we really started to see that perhaps we could push the federal government a little farther than we originally thought when it came to full legalization for all adults and not just patients. The reason I say that is that you've possibly heard of the idea of federal preemption of state law and when it comes to drugs, right? People refer to this as the notion that federal law trumps state law when it comes to drugs. There are actually two different principles that are happening there. I'm going to try not to get too legalistic on you here and get too far into the weeds, as it were. But on the one hand, preemption is the notion that a state law is actually invalid, that it's illegal under the federal law. In other words, that the law that's been passed by the state can be challenged in court and struck down, right? So that's what federal preemption is. There's a separate doctrine called dual sovereignty. And what that means is that each of us standing on the soil in any states is actually subject to two sovereigns. Missouri has power over us, and the United States has power over us. So when a state chooses to decriminalize and simply say this is not going to be a crime under state law anymore, there's no question that they can do that and leave it up to the federal government to impose its own laws, and there's no conflict there. The question is whether or not a state can adopt a regulatory system that makes it explicitly legal to produce and distribute cannabis under a state law, or whether that creates the kind of conflict that would cause that law to be illegal under federal law. There's a specific provision within the Federal Controlled Substances Act that talks about this, and what it says is the federal law does not preempt state law unless the two conflict. So this brings us to the question of whether or not Initiative 502 or Amendment 64 or any of the medical marijuana laws that include regulatory systems for dispensaries will ever be challenged and taken up to the United States Supreme Court and struck down for being illegal. The part of Initiative 502 that can't be challenged is the fact that we made it completely legal. We took all penalties away for any adult 21 and over to be in possession of marijuana. The part that could be subject to challenge is the part about whether or not we can create a system for licensing growers and processors and retail stores and letting them set up shop. Dan talked about the Department of Justice memo that was issued on August 29th, where the Deputy Attorney General Jim Cole said, we aren't, much as with the Ogden memo back in October of 2009, said as a policy matter, we're not going to spend federal resources challenging these laws. And he meant both in the dual sovereignty context, we're not going to send our law enforcement officers in to enforce federal law, but also specifically referenced the fact that they weren't going to bring a legal challenge at this time, that they weren't going to take Washington to court and try to strike down Initiative 502. What was exciting for us was that on September 10th, Deputy Attorney General James Cole appeared in front of the United States Senate Judiciary Committee. And the chair of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Leahy, engaged in a conversation with Cole about the preemption issue. And he said, isn't it true that if the state wanted to wipe all of its marijuana laws off the books, much as we did with alcohol prohibition, if we wanted to just wipe our state laws off the books, that there's nothing that the federal government could do about that? Cole said, yes, that's right. Cole said, we might have an easier time challenging the regulatory system. That might actually cause a conflict with federal law that we could challenge in court. But, he went on, he said, if we did that, then we'd be left with a state that had fully legalized marijuana with no control. We'd have no ability to regulate what was happening with the marijuana from seed to sale. And Leahy asks him back and says, well, so that pretty much sounds like an invitation to the black market. And Cole says, yes. We have no control over the marijuana, and we'd not be able to generate any tax revenues for the state to invest in